Hello, this is Dr. Goodin. This is the Nature of the Study section from Chapter 1. Here we have the DPDM template telling us the criteria that we need to satisfy. So let's start with the first one. Provide a brief discussion of the methodology and design to include a description of the data collection, procedure, and analysis, and then it tells us what not to include. We'll get to that. Here you're asked to briefly discuss two things. Discuss the methodology, which is qualitative or quantitative probably. I'll go ahead and put that in. Probably not mixed methods. And discuss the design. Several options for each methodology. So if you're using qualitative, you'll have some options. If you're using quant, you'll have other options. And one thing to also note here is overall you're also asked to describe how you will collect the data and describe your data analysis plan. That's very brief. It also says something right here that is very important for us to note. It's sort of a this is not time for that yet sort of thing. So don't get into this. These are weeds for later discussion. So there are several parts of Chapter 1 where you are encouraged to be concise, leaving elaboration and details for later discussion. So here you're told to wait on the discussion of why you chose your specific methodology and design choices over the other options. So why qualitative over quantitative, and why a case study over a phenomenological study, or whatever it may be. You're not supposed to get into that now, but you are supposed to sort of make a case for the alignment of the design and method that you're choosing with the problem, the purpose, the framework, things like that. Research questions. And so, identify and briefly discuss your methodological approach. Your choices are clear. Qualitative, you'll use spoken or written words as your data. Quantitative, you'll collect numeric data. And if you use mixed methods, you'll use both words and numeric data. Here, you simply need to identify the methodological approach you plan to use in the study. Methodological options should be carefully considered. Later, you'll be asked to justify your choice from among the other options in Chapter 3. You'll also be asked to describe the methodological alignment of your method to the problem, purpose, and research questions. And we'll touch on that actually in this section. So for a qualitative study, you might say something like, the proposed study will use a qualitative approach. For a quantitative study, you might say, the proposed study will use a quantitative approach. One sentence will usually do it. And then you're asked to discuss the design. Here you identify the methodological design you plan to use. If you're doing a qualitative study, you will use a qualitative design like ethnographic, phenomenological, case study, basic qualitative. In contrast, a quantitative design option includes experimental, quasi-experimental, correlational, just to name a few. Depending on your choice of methodological approach, there's a variety of design options, so I'll provide one example each from both qualitative and quantitative approaches. For a qualitative study, you might say something like, the proposed qualitative study will use a case study design. For a quant study, you might say something like, the proposed quantitative study will use a quasi-experimental design. Design options should be carefully considered. Later, you're going to be asked to justify your choice of these as well as the methodology from among the other options. You'll be asked to describe the alignment of your design to the problem, purpose, and research questions. So you can actually do these together in terms of the problem, purpose, and research questions. You can combine and say qualitative case study or quantitative quasi-experimental study and say how that sort of setup of methodology and design is workable and aligns with the problem, purpose, and research questions. So here you're asked to provide a brief discussion, very brief idea of how you will be collecting data for your study. You'll elaborate on your entire plan for data collection later in Chapter 3. You're likely to be using a qualitative or quant approach. In either case, you need to explain how you will collect your data. For a qualitative study, you'll likely do interviews or perform observations or evaluate documents, to name a few. For a quantitative study, you might present participants with an online survey where they respond with ratings of agreement to different statements. Alternatively, you might rate or count actions of participants in order to obtain quantitative data for your study. You're likely to restate the purpose in a sentence about data collection, such that you might say the proposed qualitative case study design or qualitative case study will use, let's say, a semi-structured interview to accomplish the purpose, which is whatever the purpose is, to understand the perceptions of African American individuals toward the George Floyd protesting, whatever your purpose may be. So let's go back here. We included a brief discussion of the methodology and design, and then we also included a description of the data collection procedure and analysis. So procedure, interviews, maybe survey, observation. And then how will you analyze? It really depends on what type of data. So you can look further into this. You can typically Google types of qualitative analysis and get some options there and sort of review them to find out which one you think is most appropriate for your study. I think the most common one that I use is content analysis. Coding, Axial is an example. But it's probably not the one I use most often. I will let you sort of get into that and decide which one is best for you. But typically what we're doing, the most common is to really try to pull themes from the interviews. The interview questions are meant to elicit responses that can be used to answer the research questions. And so you're going to look at those responses, analyze them in a certain way, code them in a certain way, and then later in Chapter 4, present that data. Right now, really all we need is to know what type of analysis you're using and what type of coding you'll be using. I often suggest that students use one of the 6-stage methods. The one that's coming to mind right now is YIN. Y-I-N. YIN has a 6-stage analysis process that can help you determine what type of analysis and coding you want to use, and also help you proceed through the steps. So it's a very obvious pattern that you can describe to your readers. Here we're going back to primary emphasis is on the design, which implies the methodology, so that's why we don't need to get into it. So who was the first methodologist to say this is a good idea? Right? Describe the design and how it works, citing that originator, author, seminal work. Seminal means first. Started the ball rolling, so to speak, in terms of case study designs, or in terms of experimental designs, or in terms of phenomenological, or maybe getting more specific with phenomenological, who's sort of the person that really came up with the idea of hermeneutic phenomenological, for instance, if you get more specific with phenomenological. And your chair may or may not ask you to be more specific in terms of phenomenological, or even with regard to case study. Is it a single case study, or is it a multiple case study? With phenomenological, it could be hermeneutic or another type. Hermeneutic is probably the most popular based on what I've seen so far. So you want to basically describe the design by citing, just tell the reader where the ideas, this design began. So the case study design began with so-and-so, and provide the citation for that. Avoid references to big textbooks, or any textbook really. Creswell and Trocum are pretty common temptations for students. So avoid these. I suggest, especially, well, it depends, but articles by Creswell are okay. Yin, Miles, and Huberman. These are names to look for. These are different options. So I should put those are three different options to get you started. And so now we're going to indicate why the selected research methodology are the best choices for the study by explaining how they align with the problem and purpose statements and the research questions. Don't simply list and describe various research methodologies and designs. Again, up here we're told, do not include specific details regarding why the methodology and design were selected over others. And so here's how I have my students proceed with this work. Pull in these statements here. And so after you've identified qualitative case study, quantitative quasi-experimental study, whatever it is, you put the methodology here, quantitative or qualitative typically, and then the design that you've identified is best for your study, and then sort of explain why it works. You can have one sentence up here, but then what you're really trying to do, and what I've created these sentences for, formulaic sentences, is to help you describe how it aligns with the rest of the study, the other components of the study. So why is a case study good to address the problem that you're addressing with your study? And just saying that it is appropriate restating the problem, and then explaining why it is appropriate, or why it supports that, or why it is strategic. You can use any synonym in order to sort of change up your wording. And then, again, the method design was appropriate for addressing the purpose, which was, again, restate the purpose and say it does this, it supports the implementation of the purpose, or whatever wording you want to use, because, and then you explain why the quantitative quasi-experimental study is good for that, because it's not a true experiment. You're trying to understand numerical data and how it relates, but without proving causality, something like that. And so you might explain how the purpose can be accomplished with the design that you've chosen. Finally, you may not have your research questions written, so you might want to come back after you've written your RQs, because really you want to be able to summarize them here. Let's say that your research questions, once you have them written, are: how do birds fly? Of course, this would not be a good research question for anyone's study, probably. Okay, so you could have those three options. And so it's appropriate to right, so you'd have a sentence like that it's strategic, or it will work to address these research questions and provide some logic. Let me take out that quote. It can provide a means by which to answer the research questions by, and whatever the design allows you to do, that will provide the information that will be used to answer the research questions. If this were a qualitative study, and say we're doing interviews, then you might say it can provide a means by which to have participants share their perceptions of the issues regarding bird flight, something like that. So depending on what type of study you're doing, that matters. So again, it's good to break these up. I often will present them as one sentence without this, but I think breaking it up is a good idea, because otherwise it becomes this really long sentence, especially once you've restated the purpose here and restated the problem here. So it's good to sort of break it up into two sentences, and then go back after you've completed these three sort of sentence or two sentences for each. You want to go back and sort of use some synonyms for the wording, so that it just doesn't say it's appropriate for, it's appropriate for, and so on and so forth. You want to say it's strategic in that it supports this, or it's well designed to implement the purpose. Things like that. Just use alternate wording instead of sounding robotic and formulaic. But it's good to use the formula to get it down, to get everything sort of in place, and then to mess with the wording. You want to use about 1 to 2 pages to this section. This should be maybe 1 paragraph. This should be maybe 1 to 2 paragraphs, and this will definitely be 2 to 3 paragraphs. And so I'll make note of that. So one thing that I always tell people when you are given these sort of 1 to 2 pages, it doesn't mean it can't be 2.5 pages. You'd want to clear that with your chair, but really what you want to do is it's better to overwrite than underwrite, but you don't want to drone on forever. So be concise. Try to hit that sweet spot between 1 and 2 pages. But understand that writing a little more and then trimming it down is a lot easier than trying to figure out what to write next. And so having these sentences to sort of fill in the blanks. Here's one for seminal works. I'm just going to say Bob. Right? So you can have sentences like this and just fill them in. And then elaborate just a little. And here I talked about some of the wording you could use. So one sentence for methodology, and one sentence for design. You can go ahead and get the seminal author put in up here. So you're going to do the same thing here. I'm just going to change the word to design. And I would actually take this out here and probably include it down here with regard to the design. We're really wanting to know who sort of came up with that design and originated it and suggest using it. And then you want to talk about something like data will be collected using semi-structured interviews, with 12 to 17 participants from a small town in the southern United States, something like that. And you might go ahead and put, I think the new DPDM asks for the, let me check, was this back in the purpose? Yes, it was. You can still go ahead and, if you want to reiterate, you can put in the instrument that you're going to use, or using the Beck Depression Inventory, or whatever survey, if you're doing a quantitative study, an instrument or survey. And so, get this a little more organized for you. Feel free to pause, go back. But so let's do something that I don't normally do, but here we're going to state our methodology and what it is, and describe it briefly. Our purpose, our design, what it is and what it can do, preferably citing the seminal author. And then how data will be collected, and then how data will be analyzed. Okay, and then so I made note that you can use qual or quant. Several options for designs under each methodology. And also for data collection methods. If you're using qualitative, you might use interviews, observation, focus groups, though I don't suggest those, surveys, instruments, observations, all sorts of ways to collect data. Analysis, what type of data you use will determine what type of analysis you use. You want to just touch upon what type of analysis and what type of coding you'll be using, and you can elaborate on those further in chapter 3. Cite the seminal works. You may have already done this above. And then avoid references to general textbooks. We want to get to the articles. They can be articles by Cresswell, but I really do suggest getting into people like Yin and Miles and Huberman. Indicate why the methodology and design choices are the best choices for the study by explaining how they align with the problem and purpose statements as well as the research questions. So again, this is alignment issues, and I suggest using these formulaic sentences to get you started there. And then after you're done, make sure that you're sort of around the 1 to 2 page limit, and trim down if you need to, edit, and then edit some more. Make sure that you include everything the DPDM asks for, no more and no less. Part of the problem students have is sort of interpreting the DPDM. What does it mean when it asks me to indicate what is selected and so forth? That's part of the chair's job, and in this case I'm trying to provide that sort of explanation to everyone, to interpret the DPDM in similar templates that other universities will have, to interpret that for all of you so that you don't always have to wait for the next meeting with your chair or with me. I'll see you soon. Have a wonderful day.